So this first talk is about parish history, where we came from. I'm just going to try and lose some people who've appeared at the side of the screen. There they go. Sorry, everybody. Humankind is essentially a storytelling animal. That means I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part of. So wrote Alistair MacIntyre in his History of the Decline of Ethical Thinking in the Modern World. To look at our history is to understand how to act in the present. In the Once and Future Parish, I particularly attend to the story from 1945. But to begin to think about the parish as such, it helps to go right back to see the full story. And that, of course, begins in the New Testament with the story of Christ and his church. From the beginning, the church was local. Christ attended his local synagogue in Nazareth. Later evangelists went to the synagogue in whichever town they happened to find themselves and preached there. As the church developed independently, there would be a local Eucharistic community in a town or city presided over by its bishop. On his journey to martyrdom in Rome, Ignatius of Antioch at the end of the 1st century greets churches through their bishop, who is the center of unity. Yet even then, there were believers outside the city in the parochia, the beside the house, the dwelling beside, and clergy went out to minister to them in the countryside. Apostolic Canon 34 from the 4th century even speaks of a particular kind of country bishop with a parochia. But each one should only do those things which pertain to his own church parochia and the rural regions which belong to it. John Zizoulas dates this idea of a country bishop back to the chorepiscopi of the 2nd century, though they quickly disappear as a separate caste. Gradually, with the spread of Christianity, there are fewer bishops. We know that in North Africa, there were kind of scores of them at a time when there were only scores of towns. So we know that in North Africa, say in the 3rd century, there was a bishop sort of in every little place. But gradually there are fewer bishops and more presbyters or priests. And it's these latter who tend to lead Eucharistic communities or local churches. It was a priest with whom St. Alban, there he is as a puppet on my first slide, the first English martyr, exchanged clothes with a priest in Roman times. And it's important to remember that English Christianity begins then, and there may have been Christians surviving when the new waves of evangelism came from Ireland and Scotland into Northumbria and from Italy with Augustine of Canterbury. Queen Bertha already had a Christian church, St. Martin's, in the middle of my slide, and therefore must have had a priest to serve it when Augustine arrived in Canterbury. And there was a further church, the Four Crowned Martyrs, there by 624. So there were a lot of churches very, very early on. Pope Gregory told Augustine famously to make use of pagan holy sites to establish churches. And there were many by the time Bede wrote his famous Ecclesiastical History of the English People in the 8th century. And I've given you the church in Rudston, Yorkshire, which has about the tallest standing stone in England in its churchyard, which will be a deliberate thing to do. St. Ced, sent down from Lindisfarne, built a wooden church astride the Roman fort at what is now Bradwell, and became the first bishop of that people. And among the Anglo-Saxons, we begin to hear of minster churches. There is some scholarly debate about their purpose. The word derives from monastery, and many early missionary bishops and priests were monks. Historians have tended to assume that minsters were centres of missionary activity, but Richard Morris in The Church and the Landscape and others argue that often they were actually private chapels of great earls, or just settlements of secular priests living in community. But there do seem to have been bands of clergy who established smaller field churches, like this little one at Escombe, which is now a stone church, but is an Anglo-Saxon little church. Originally, the field churches were subject to the minster, and it's out of these that we get parishes. As Nicholas Orme emphasises, it was lay people who established independent parishes mostly. Settlement was becoming more communal and organised into villages which wanted their own church. And so the lord of the manor would endow a church and a parsonage. And gradually these churches obtained rites of burial, of baptism, and so on. Sometimes they paid a bit of tithe to the minster, but soon they became fully independent. Tithe, of course, is a tenth of one's income or produce. In Genesis 14, Abraham offers Melchizedek the priest a tithe, and this became part of Mosaic law, which the church imitated. In England, King Ethelwulf granted the church tithe rights, and this was confirmed again in 1285, carrying on right through the Reformation until 1836, and then in some form till 1936 as a kind of tax. Tithe was money to support a priest, and it was paid by all householders. To become a parish, you needed to have rights of tithe paid to the rector. Orme judges that the instability of waves of Viking invasion in the 10th century and then the Norman invasion probably enabled a number of churches to become independent parishes. By the 12th century, the parochial landscape, as we understand it, was fully established. And minsters like mine, that's Southwell Minster over there, declined. We became a church for secular priests and a private chapel for the archbishop. Others dwindled into parish churches or became cathedrals like York and Lincoln. Not only was the rector of the parish supported by tithes, but he might also have glebe, farmland in strips, or a whole glebe farm, which he could farm himself or let. So you've got there the remains of strip farming in the ridge and furrow appearing in the Leicestershire landscape. And the priest's house at Muchney belongs to the National Trust and can be visited, but it too has kind of glebe land around it. This is the main difference from today, in that in the Middle Ages, the parish was an economic unit. As parishioners' fortunes rose or fell, so did those of the rector. He farmed among them, often his glebe forming thin strips among their own as an enacted symbol of their independence. You can still see this at Laxton in Nottinghamshire. To begin with, the parish priest was responsible for the building, as well as providing its books and candles, its vestments. The canons of Edgar of 1015 to 18 say he must provide for divine ministry and pure service, although repair costs were often requested from local people with land. In the 13th century, we see the beginnings of attempts to make the laity responsible for the nave, the part where they sat, and the incumbent only for the chancel inside the arch here at St. Botolph, Harden, which has some of the earliest war paintings in England and give you a sense of what it must have looked like in the medieval period. This making the laity responsible for the nave might seem oppressive, putting more financial burdens on them. But Carol Cargo points out in an article that several bishops opposed the move. They were worried, she surmises, that this might give too much power to lay people. Since it inaugurated a period of intense lay involvement in church life, with mystics such as Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp, confraternities and later parish plays, her surmise seems likely. Lay people seem to have relished having control of part of the building, and their richer members building chapels and porches in the nave areas. So the medieval parish was then both a communal, economic, and spiritual community. There's a vivid picture provided in Nicholas Orme's Going to Church in Medieval England, which has surprises for those who think there was little participation by the laity then. This is the part of this picture forms the cover of his wonderful book. One surprise for me was how much of the service might be in English. Orme prayers said by the clergy during aspersions, the announcements, the bidding prayer, the sermon, and the distribution of holy bread after Mass. He also suggests that offices such as baptism and marriage had even more elements in native English, including the vows. The holy bread, of course, was baked by local women and distributed to everyone after Mass. So there was a kind of participation there. And everyone also kissed the pax bread, that was usually a kind of piece of wood with a picture of Christ on the cross. There were other surprises. There were the occasional female church warden, and he cites a reference to a woman acolyte. In plays and in the highly mimetic liturgical celebrations and processions, women took a full part as producers and participants, according to researches in Suffolk by James Stokes. Parish life involved a great deal of fundraising, and we see the arrival of the church ale in this period, where you would probably have it in the graveyard. You'd sell beer after church. Sir Eamon Duffy and other scholars who stress the vibrancy and health of parish life before the Reformation are quite correct. There is a darker side to parochial organisation in this period, and that lay in the way the Norman kings encouraged the transfer of rectorships of parishes, and thus the revenues that went with them to support monasteries. They would institute a vicar to look after the parish while holding the rectorship themselves. While it's true that monasteries often offered social services and medical expertise, this was a cruel loss of money to the parish and the vicar, and led to the existence of characters such as the poor parson of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Here's part of the description of him from the prologue. He was a poor country parson, but rich he was in holy thought and work. He was a learned man, also a clerk, who Christ's own gospel truly sought to preach. Devoutly his parishioners would he teach. Gracious he was and wondrously diligent, patient in adversity and well content. Many times thus proven had he excommunicated not to force a fee, that's a tithe, but rather would he give, there is no doubt, unto his poor parishioners about some of his income, even of his property. He could in little find sufficiency. Wide was his parish, houses far asunder, but never did he fail for rain nor thunder, in sickness or in sin or any state, to visit the farthest, regardless their financial state, going by foot and in his hand a stave. This fine example to his flock he gave, that first he wrought and afterwards he taught, out of the gospel then that text he caught. As I said, the word for the Middle English for fee is tithe, but we're never clear whether he's a rector or a vicar, though the landlord directly questions him on his status. Sire priest, quoth he, art thou a vicar or art a person? Say sooth, say truth by thy faith. Now, we think of parson as a generic term for a Christian minister, but in the medieval period and beyond, it had a more technical meaning, as in Blackstone. A parson, persona ecclesiae, is one that has full possession of all the rights of a parochial church. He's called person because by his person, the church, which is an invisible body, is represented. And he is in himself a body corporate in order to protect and defend the rights of the church, which he personates by a perpetual succession. I think that's quite interesting. This idea that he is the representative and he makes sure that the rights of the church are held in perpetual succession. When Henry VIII broke from Rome and made himself head of the Anglican Church, he kept these positions of rector and vicar, but took away rectorships from monasteries, which of course he dissolved, but allowed individual important lay people to keep rectorships. But he did, however, ensure that a cleric was resident in his parish, whereas hitherto, and again later on, of course, a cleric could have a bunch of parishes and keep the revenue of them all, appointing vicars and curates to do the donkey work. The Reformation parish continued to combine the economic and the spiritual functions, with tithes continued as before. Henry also gave a portion of the mammoth estates he'd sequestered from the monastic houses to the church, though he never gave the endowment he promised. And what he did give forms some of the glebe the church still owns. In the 16th century, it was the law to attend your parish church on Sundays, and non-attenders could be fined. But the parish was also required to take on new revenue raising and discipline through the new poor laws. Formerly, monasteries had given out poor relief, but this was now devolved upon the parish. In 1547, for example, money was to be raised through a compulsory tax gathered on Sundays at church through the collection plate. Parishes were also required to send beggars and vagrants back to the parishes from which they came, where various punishments were visited upon them. Justices of the peace, many of whom, of course, would be clergy, and parish overseers had the job of discriminating between the deserving and the undeserving poor. All this continued through the 18th century until the new poor laws of the 19th. So people might talk about being on the parish, and by that they mean that the parish gives them some money which they will receive in their own home. Though, of course, later on you have the establishment of workhouses, and parishes are often quite involved in those. The big change that the Reformation does make, of course, is in liturgy and worship. Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer devised out of the monastic offices services of morning and evening prayer suitable for lay people to join in with, and which will be the same everywhere, whatever your parish. And this liturgical uniformity lasted for hundreds of years, with the gap of the Civil War. And communion at first was celebrated as on my slide, with a long table facing east-west. So that's why the priest is on the north side. I'm old enough to remember when a low church vicar would celebrate the Eucharist from sitting round the side of the altar on the north. I've also given a picture there of the chapel at Little Gidding and its eagle lectern, which was bought in 1623, where the authorized version of the Bible would be read from. So the Reformation left church orders, bishops, priests and deacons, as before, and parish boundaries. The High Church revival under Archbishop Laud reordered the sanctuary and instituted an altar rail. You can see a little one there at Little Gidding. But the most seismic upheaval was the Civil War, and the consequent rule by Cromwell and Parliament till 1660 saw Charles II and the Church of England return. With the abolition of bishops in 1646, overall church administration and record keeping collapsed, so we're not always sure what went on. We do know that 3,000 clergy were officially ejected and many more unofficially. The prayer book was illegal, as were burials, considered superstitious, and church marriages. Parishes were not allowed to celebrate Christmas or Easter. You can imagine how devastating this was on parishioners. Infant baptism survived in some places, but was often denied to the non-godly, people who were not enthusiastic Puritans, and also to illegitimate children, which was cruel. Many churches closed or received no minister at all, especially in the country, which young Puritan clergy found intractable and moved quickly back to urban centres where Puritanism was more popular. The Restoration parish no longer required attendance by law, and there grew up independent, non-conforming churches in competition with it. But the Church of England was still very much the church of the English people, for whom Protestantism was equated with being British, as Linda Colley and other scholars have argued. The old view, as in this Hogarth engraving, that the 18th century parish slept while the parson hunted has been questioned, but it was a time of relative inactivity compared to the 19th century, which followed it. The Queen Anne's bounty of 1704 bought land to augment poor livings, and its money was later given to administer by the church commissioners. But a similar plan to build new churches for the growing population of London failed to raise the money. The main challenge to the parish in this period was the Methodist revival. "The world is my parish," said John Wesley. And of course, he had a great appeal to ordinary people and to a kind of model of conversion. The Methodist revival would then inform the evangelical revival within the Church of England itself. One of the outworkings of the evangelical revival, which is the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, was a renewed pastoral vision of the parish, interestingly. Charles Simeon, 1759 to 1836, the famous evangelical vicar of Holy Trinity, Cambridge, was an assiduous visitor of everyone in his parish, always asking, as I put on the slide, "I am come to inquire about your welfare. Are you happy?" Rather wonderful. He also faithfully visited the local prison and subsidized bakers to sell bread at prices local people could afford. Elizabeth Jay's study of the Victorian evangelicalism points out it was evangelicals who increased the frequency of Holy Communion services from quarterly to monthly, and were assiduous in teaching the young their catechism from the Book of Common Prayer. Here also Simeon is a good example. Not only was his own conversion prompted by his reception of the sacrament, but he loved the prayer book, saying, "Never do I find myself nearer to God than I am in the reading desk. The finest sight of heaven would be a whole congregation using the prayers of the liturgy in the true spirit of them." This revival of the pastoral and liturgical life of the parish after some 18th century neglect was continued by the Tractarians, the High Church revival movement, which sought to restore the Catholic tradition of the church and to stress her holiness and independence. S.A. Skinner's study of the social and political concerns of the Oxford movement argues the locus clerical government was to be the parish, whose functional autonomy was an antidote to the growth and pluralization of the state. Subsidiarity was the principle here, the idea that everything that can be done should be done at the lowest, most local level, something that's also very important in Catholic social teaching later on, but you're getting it here earlier in the Oxford movement. The relative autonomy of the parson in his freehold involved a liberty denied to the church at the state level. In the parish, this is what he says the Tractarians thought, there should be a certain redistribution of wealth from rich to poor and spiritual equality within the church itself. Here, the fierce campaign waged against pews by Tractarian priests. For what these meant at the time were a series of little private sections within the church, rented yearly by the wealthy, with the poor either excluded or pushed to the back. Sometimes they would be up in the balcony, as you can see here. Thomas Keble, the brother of John, who became the ideal of the parish pastor for the early Oxford movement, was one of the first to attack the practice of pew rents in his parish at Bisley. He actually stopped up 13 separate entrances constructed by mill owners to allow direct access to their private space in the church. I love to think what they must have thought when they arrived and found it blocked. There's a mention in this paragraph of freehold, which is what the rector enjoyed until it was abolished in the 1970s. It referred to his holding the tithes and parsonage and the whole benefice freely, freehold. He could only be removed through gross misbehaviour, quite narrowly defined. It gave the Church of England parochial ministry its character and its stability, so a rector might keep a single benefice for life. The parson naturalists, scientists, and poets are unthinkable without it, and the fact that the incumbent was not an employee gave to the Anglican ministry a certain freedom and status. There are still a few parsons out there who have freehold, and they treasure it, and gosh, does it render them independent. The 19th century saw the massive emigration of the population into the cities to work in factories or service industries. And the population rose from 6.4 million in 1750 to nearly 18 million in 1851. This was a massive challenge for the church to provide buildings for these numbers. And throughout the 19th century, after the ending of the Napoleonic Wars, there were waves of building and establishment of new parishes, enjoined by the Enabling Act of 1818. So if your church is not medieval, the great likelihood is that it is Victorian, because they just built so many. Bishop Bloomfield of London built 10 churches in Bethnal Green alone. On Portsea Island, Canon Jacobs of St Mary's started St Barnabas, St Faith, St Mary Mission, St Boniface, St Stephen's, and St Wilfrid's, all carved out of his giant parish. Both Tractarians and evangelicals had their successes, although the clergy numbers involved are sometimes eye-watering. So Christopher Ramsey says, St John the Divine Kennington in 1900 had 10 curates. This church had over 500 children in clubs while running soup kitchens and had a comprehensive visiting programme. There were over 150 school visitors alone. Church attendance rose from 1455 in the years 1886 to 8 to 1,802 in the year 1902. This, he says, is outstanding because the parish and church were nearly all working class, and that's St John Kennington on the slide. Again, this is a period of lay revitalisation, and many urban parishes use teams of men, and particularly women, to visit every home and to assess practical needs, as well as encourage people in their faith and let the priests know when they needed a visit. Walter Hooke, who did so much to establish new parishes in Leeds, accompanied this work with the setting up of lay-led cooperatives. Although scholars sometimes criticise the Victorian Church as failing the working classes, this is somewhat unfair. Hugh MacLeod estimates that up to a fifth of the London working class, he says 15 to 20% attended church, and this figure rises to 40% in Bristol. Some of our football teams, for example, began as parish ventures. This is a picture of Tottenham Hotspur. And there were multiple attempts to provide boxing and other healthy pursuits, as well as the soup kitchens and mothers' meetings. Where the real change comes in parish life in this period is with the increasing separation between the spiritual and the economic and social aspects of the parish. Gradually, the state began to provide services formerly offered by the church in welfare and educational provision. Because in the past, you know, the vicar would teach children to read as they kind of met to do their catechism in the pews. In 1894, civil parish or local councils were established, which had formerly been vestry committees as part of the parish. Instead, parochial church councils did the work of church administration and repairs, no longer representing the whole people of the parish, except as a spiritual entity under the cura souls of the incumbent. So the Vicar of Dibley, that BBC comedy, tends to confuse things by presenting a parish council as if it were a PCC, which is interesting as it suggests a desire for a more holistic conception of parish life. This change meant that for the first time in its history in England, the parish lost its centrality as the instrument of local administration. While in the country it still sometimes has a very central role, usually its centrality, its importance has to be earned. Ironically, considering the usual perception of the distance of the Anglican Church from working class people, I know several parish priests from such communities who find that the dearth of resources means they find themselves central to people's conception of the area and called upon to represent them on many, many occasions. And you can tell me if that chimes with your experience. Parish structure remained stable in England until the 1960s. In the early council and other new estates, churches were provided, like there's a massive new church in Paulsgrove on the edge of Portsmouth, though sadly they were not usually given graveyards. Moreover, this is far less the case in recent years. And this is why we have the estates task group as part of the renewal and reform agenda, which is seeking to work on out-of-town estates where the parish is either rather distant or to work with those parishes. The 1950s saw some modest growth, and perhaps we'll have time to talk about that afterwards, why the church grew in the 1950s. They had more worshippers, more baptisms. But already by the 1940s, we see the beginning of the merging of parishes in Arthur Smith's South Ormsby experiment in highly underpopulated Lincolnshire. He had a minibus and went round the different churches doing services in different places with a team ministry. From the 1970s, villages found they had to share clergy, and one priest per parish became rare in the country. It was made easier by the ending of freehold in the 1976, when all clergy now had, or developed into all clergy having common tenure. And although they have a stipend rather than a salary, I would argue they're treated much more like employees than before. And of course, they can be appointed to jobs with an end date. At the same time, the glebe was transferred to diocesan boards of finance. This was to equalise rich and poor parishes and to stop incumbents selling the glebe off, but it removed the independence of the parish. The old glebe was now to provide help with stipends, but often dioceses do not manage it well, and often the money disappears into general diocesan expenses rather than being ring-fenced for stipends. And of course, some glebe went to parishes, and others went to the church commissioners to give it back in the form of stipends. But that has proved rather problematic. Now that the Darlow formula is no more, and a whole new way of spending the commissioner's money on mission projects has been introduced. There is still something called Lowest Income Community Fund, or I think that's what it's called. But even that does not all go straight to stipends. Now, of course, parish structure is under threat. Even in the early church, the local church, whether urban or rural, was its own Eucharistic community with a priest. Now there are plans for huge mission amalgamations of 20 or more parishes. In Leicester, with one oversight minister and one other, not necessarily ordained. Will that, in any sense, be a parish? What does this short account tell us about what it might be to be a parishioner? The parish developed in the 2nd century as a way to make a faith community in which face-to-face communication and local rootedness could be expressed and lived. Although the Church of England is not alone in having a parish system, it's universal in ancient Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran, Presbyterian traditions. It has been strongly identified with the cure of souls for everyone in an established church in England, which aims to be something of a spiritual NHS for the English people. What would the Church of England be without the parish? Even now, 40% of its worshippers live in rural areas, where the parish is very important. But some dioceses are, to all intents and purposes, abandoning traditional ministry in these areas, although with heroic exceptions, such as Heather Butcher here on my slide, who, with another priest, looks after 17 parishes in rural Norfolk and says, for me, the parish has definitely not had its day. We have parishes because people of faith in the past built beautiful stone or brick churches, which survive to this day, and are often the most characterful edifice in the surrounding area. How can we keep faith with this history? For as Simone Weil, no nostalgic thinker, put it, the past once destroyed never returns. The destruction of the past is perhaps the greatest of all crimes. We must keep, above all, well to the fore in any political, legal, or technical innovations, some arrangement whereby human beings may once more be able to recover their roots. So I shall end there. I've put a few sources up on the screen, and I have a few questions